All right, thank you. Welcome back. I hope you were able to refill your coffee and move your legs. Gosh, we heard so much from the last panel, and we're going to pivot a little bit. I know as we think about the policing or public safety ecosystem, there have been a rise sort of in how folks are thinking about public safety differently. And this next panel is all about that. This is how we care for one another, understanding and expanding behavioral crisis response in Minneapolis. And so in a moment, I'm going to invite my panelists and facilitator to come up here. I will read their bios. Unfortunately, Chief Brian O'Hara is not going to be here. I know that's going to land all kinds of ways for all kinds of people, and that's okay. He got pulled away last minute in the way that people who are police chiefs do sometimes. But Ganesha is going to join us. She's gracefully offered to join us, and so she'll be subbing. So the facilitator of this panel is Dr. Michelle Phelps. I'll have her come on up, a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. She's the author of the Minneapolis Reckoning, Race, Violence, and the Politics of Policing in America. Her award-winning research on the criminal legal system has been published in leading academic journals and featured in major media outlets like the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and the New Yorker. Next to her, we have Candace Hanson, the executive director of Canopy Roots. Candace is a licensed professional clinical counselor and a former behavioral crisis response program manager. Candace's career focus and passion are on providing culturally responsive care and thinking innovatively about how clients and clinicians of color are supported and engaged in treatment settings and in the workplace. Such important work. Next, we have Ganesha. I don't have your bio, so I'll let you introduce yourself after you sit down. I know that we've met her. And then finally, our own Dr. Katie Remington Cunningham, the research director here at the JRC. Katie leads our efforts to engage in participatory and collaborative community-led research. Yes, woo! Along with projects and evaluations with our partner organizations. She holds a PhD in education with a focus on developmental psychology from Stanford University and a master's in secondary education from the University of Missouri. Thank you all for joining us. I'll pass it off to Dr. Phelps to kick off the panel.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. I am an academic, and so, as usual, I've brought some slides to the party. And I'm hoping here just to open with a little bit of context for us to set the stage for this conversation that I think is so important and vital right now. So I want to take us back just for a minute to May 2020 and the police killing of George Perry Floyd Jr., which has been in the ether, in the conversation this morning. But I want to take us back to the way that the streets in Minneapolis, but also across the country and across the globe, flooded with protest. And one of the key demands that came out of that protest was to rethink when and where we need to send armed police in the context of 911 calls for help. And in the wake of those protests in 2020, we saw in Minneapolis, but also across the country, this new approach to public safety, including in Minneapolis, launching in 2021, the Behavioral Crisis Response, or BCR program, run by Canopy Roots. And in the public conversation, these kinds of programs, which go by a number of different labels, including community responder programs, crisis response programs, and other terms, they're often talked about as alternatives to policing. And certainly that is much of the public conversation and the impetus, the political will to create these programs. But the work to create the BCR started years before 2020. And I think we need to understand it not only as a public safety intervention, but as a public health intervention, and one in which we're expanding the models of care, or as Canopy team talks about it, appropriate responses to 911 calls instead of just alternative responses. And programs like the BCR are responding not only to public concern about police violence. 1 in 4 fatal interactions with police involve somebody with a serious mental illness, but also the broader crisis of mental health and the lack of mental health care in our country today. So 1 in 20 adults in the U.S. experiences a serious mental health issue each year, and 1 in 4 adults lacks access to consistent health care services. These kinds of expanded response models are popping up across the country. There are now over 100 911 dispatched emergency response programs for behavioral crisis alone, which is the red dots in this graphic. And so it's not just Minneapolis, and part of what that means is that the lessons from Minneapolis can travel across the country. Okay, so quickly, what is the BCR? As you'll hear a lot more about today, some of the key program models include that it is an independent first responder. So unlike co-responder models or CIT training of officers, the BCR sends mental health professionals to respond to 911 calls independent of other first responders. They provide 24/7 mobile coverage across the city. They send in unarmed behavioral health teams rooted in compassion and care and culturally responsive services, which include crisis intervention, counseling, and connection to services in the community. And importantly, these services are free and voluntary for recipients. And both of those words are really important. This is a public health intervention. The BCR does not bill insurance. This is provided by the city through Canopy routes for residents free of charge. And people who engage with the BCR have a lot of agency and consent in that interaction, and that in fact drives the encounter, which is really different than what can happen when law enforcement responds to these kinds of calls. Just a quick sense of the scale. So now when you call 911 in Minneapolis, the dispatcher can send police, they can send the fire department, they can send emergency medical services, and they can now dispatch the BCR. And the BCR has rapidly expanded. Right now, BCR responds to about 900 calls per month. That's compared to about 350 calls per month at launch. So we've seen this rapid growth since 2021. This is a graph on your right that just shows the distribution across the city and all of the responses that the BCR is providing by ward over the last contract year in 24 to 25. So you can see the numbers range from 207 calls in Ward 13 to things like over 2,000 calls in that year in Ward 6. So they're serving across the city. This still represents a relatively small share of all 911 calls. There are a lot of types of calls that get dispatched through 911 to these 4 different types of responses. But BCR is now taking the vast majority of all calls related to behavioral health in the city in these different places. And just as important as the quantitative metrics on the program's expansion and the way that they have created a new model of responding to these calls in the community are the success stories. So as you'll hear a little bit more about from Katie and the MNJRC's research, people who interact with the BCR tend to have just glowing responses. And what I think is really profound is the way that BCR really turns to individuals, honors their agency, and works with them to build up with their strengths a new path for them moving forward. So I really encourage everybody to watch this video, which is available on the 1 Million Madly Motivated Moms website. This was a video created in collaboration with Georgetown Law Center for Innovations in Community Safety. And they share the story of a mother who called the BCR about a mental health crisis that her daughter was experiencing. And the mother told the interviewers, "I was just blown away by them meeting my daughter where she was at. Seeing my daughter being empowered to make the decision for herself, it saved my family. So I think it's these kinds of stories, it's these kinds of qualitative testimonies about how this intervention, about how care and compassion and mental health training and connection to resources can really stabilize folks in community and prevent a range of negative outcomes and contribute to both individual and community thriving. So I'm so excited to talk more about this program with the panelists. And I'm going to start by introducing you just briefly, again, to all of our speakers, and to go down the row here and ask if each of you could tell us a little bit about how you came to this work and what your role is related to the BCR.
Hi, I'm Candace again. I think my whole career had really been focused on clinical work, and in 2021, when the city of Minneapolis put out the RFP for this type of work, my partners and I at Canopy, we were kind of like, oh wow, this is like right up our alley. However, they're probably not going to pick us, so we're not going to do it. Well, someone else later on, we don't know who, forwarded it to us again and said, hey, you should really apply. And we're like, okay, we'll just, we'll apply and see how it goes. But we were really passionate about it because we thought, the way that we work and our vision for providing mental health services and retaining staff of color and staff who are from marginalized communities to work with the community members who look like them and share culture with them, how we work, it would work really well for this program. And the vision that we have for this type of work also would work for this program. And it was myself and a couple of other clinicians working at Canopy at that time working on it. And, we really focused on, a response that didn't require police. And so our RFP really focused on that of like, hey, we've been mental health professionals. We've been working in the community for years. So we know that it's not like dangerous for us to go out there and meet our fellow human typically in the community. So we really focused on creating this model and submitting this model, and it was selected. The three of us who submitted this RFP, we had all of us had the background of working in mental health in community-based settings, as well as working in residential crisis services and school-based crisis services as well. So we kind of brought a wealth of experience to that as well. So that was really how I got into this work, the city of Minneapolis wanted this work, and then my colleagues and I at Canopy were like, yeah, we could do this and we could do it well, so.
Hello again. I do want to say before I start, I'm sure y'all were confused because I look so much like the chief, but he actually was super disappointed because I felt like it was actually an honor that you all even asked him to be on this panel. They specifically asked him to be here because of his support and belief in the work, and so he was super disappointed to disappoint you. I got in this work, y'all, for those of you all who were in the room when I spoke earlier, I told you all that I have a loved one who struggles with bipolar, right? And for those of you all know, but at least the way that it shows up in my life is you're either worried about somebody killing them and they're manic, or you worry about them killing themselves when they're depressed. And so it's this cycle, and like I said, it first showed up my very first day as a chief of staff, so of the police commissioner. So that has sat with me, and so I created or helped create the first co-responder model at the Baltimore Police Department. And then since then, I worked with a tech company to actually build out software for the Seattle CARES program and for the Albuquerque program, Alternative Response. And then I actually was a consultant just around here for the POLAD Foundation to help local cities. And then my last piece with this is I just helped, before I came to this role, Oklahoma City roll out their first alternative response under the fire department. So I continue to try to do this work. I keep trying to go over to OCS a little bit and play with them, but my job is at the police department, so that's how I got into this work.
Thank you so much. You're an excellent sub. You bring a wealth of knowledge. So perhaps obviously the way that I come to this space is with my research hat on. So about 2 years ago, in conversation with folks at Canopy, they reached out to us at the JRC and said, we're really just beginning this work, and we actually want to and care deeply about evaluation kind of from the jump, right? So we know, as the first panel actually talked a little bit about, policies are good and practice is important, but implementation and actually understanding how things are working, how things are feeling in community matters deeply. So we partnered with Canopy directly to undertake this large evaluation of the Behavioral Crisis Response Program. And so my role in that as the research director is really to support our research team in that process. And so we've wrapped up, we are putting the sort of final touches on our evaluation. There's a little one-pager in the back that sort of previews some of our findings, and that report will be coming out early next year. But I had the real privilege of being able to work really closely with Candace and all of the responders and be able to actually dig more deeply into important research questions. So I benefit from having a facilitator who's also a researcher who sort of teed up some of the background and some of the data on this program and on this approach. But really, I've spent the last 2 years digging deeply into the kind of questions that Canopy had about their work, right? So not just what are our numbers, how many people are we serving, but like what is our impact, not just for residents who are in crisis, but for their community members, their social circles, their family members, and for others in the ecosystem. So we were able to really get a wide perspective from law enforcement at almost every precinct, from the chief even, who's worked closely and was excited to be here today, so I'm bummed to miss him, but also from EMS, from fire, from dispatch, from Hennepin County Health, to really sit down and interview folks to understand their perspectives and experiences with this program. So that's the sort of research hat that I bring to this space.
Terrific. So I want to start by talking more about the model and looking backwards a bit at how Canopy Roots has built and grown the BCR program over time. And I want to get into that by thinking about the scope of what kinds of calls do we understand as behavioral crisis, and what kinds of calls has the BCR responded to, and what kind of calls might programs like the BCR respond to in the future. In Minneapolis, of course, this is partly constrained by the city's contract, but as we can talk about today, there's lots of different ways to think about how you can build these kinds of programs, and I'd just love to hear more about how you all at Canopy have thought about that changing scope and where we might go.
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned, the main constraint is the contract. That from the very beginning we agreed on this very mental health, behavioral health focused scope, where we're taking calls that have some elements of mental health, and then what we saw over time basically is that we kind of started to move outside of that scope. And I think that that's important to note because, well, first of all, scope creep happens, right? When there's a need and something's new, you start to just kind of like, okay, we'll take on more, we'll do more because we want to help, right? And then also at a certain point we have to stop that because, well, we have to be insured. So we have to stay within our scope for our insurers. And so but I think that kind of the tendency to scope creep really showed me something about the Minneapolis program, that there were many, many more call types that could be taken by someone other than police, right? Because what was happening is that dispatch was sending those calls to us too. And even though they were outside of our scope, and of course we were agreeing to them as well for a while until we understood the extent of the scope creep, but I think it really showed that there's more solutions needed for these other calls that are not covered in our scope. And, one of the ones that I like to think about as being like really useful for Minneapolis maybe is like a community responder model at the same time, similar to how they do in Albuquerque and in other cities doing behavioral health and community response together. But I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the calls that we take in Minneapolis are focused on behavioral health again, and then the main piece is that these are calls where there's no weapons and there's no physical violence happening, and there's also there might be substance use, but the substance use is not escalating the situation. So that gets kind of dicey, but to determine what's appropriate in situations like that. But, dispatch is pretty amazing with figuring that out. So that's basically the criteria. So we go to calls then when people are intoxicated. We go to calls where folks are unhoused and seem like they are vulnerable because of that, or vulnerable because their mental health is related to them being unhoused and vulnerable, right? We often end up going to calls where folks are suicidal and they have expressed intent to act. And then we have to kind of make the call about, do they stay in the community? Do they get, institutional support? Those are really difficult calls. And then a call type that we did not expect when we first rolled out this program, and it was kind of a mistake that we made. We literally did not anticipate that the police would ever ask for our help. So we just didn't even plan for that. And then of course, after a couple of weeks into the program, that started to happen, and we're like, oh wait, hold on. We gotta figure out what our protocol is on those calls, because we at the beginning of the rollout of the program, there was a lot of, like, I would say, angst from the police officers, worried that BCR is going to replace them or things like that. It's like, no, we're actually here to support you in what you're doing. And there's a need for you just in other calls and in certain situations in our calls. So yeah, we end up going to calls where officers get to the scene and they see that, hey, this is not, BCR is probably a better responder for this call, so then they will request us to come, and then they'll go on their way as they need to, or stay and support us if we'd like. So that's a general description of the types of calls we take right now, and as I mentioned, there's quite a few more that could be taken that aren't strictly mental health, but maybe are loosely associated with mental health or behavioral health, but also related to some of the other social determinants of health, right? So yeah, did I answer your question?
Perfect. And that was actually a great transition, because Ganesha, I wanted to turn to you next to say a little bit more about what is your perception of how officers perceive the BCR, and from a law enforcement perspective, what is the role of BCR and how does the program help officers to do their work?
Yeah, I'll talk in general just because I haven't talked to officers in Minneapolis about BCR, but I've seen this across the country. Generally, there is 100% pushback. The pushback often comes because it's like, we're going to have to go save them anyway, right? Like they're civilian folks. They're going to get there and somebody's going to get hurt. And so we're going to have to, so that is generally, I've seen that literally in every place. The other thing that I'll comment on, which sounds like y'all have gotten over the hump or never had this hump, is that 911 dispatchers don't want to send civilians to those calls because they don't want to have the liability or feel bad that somebody's going to go there and get hurt. So they just feel better to send somebody where I guess they're like, if officers are supposed to get hurt, so, send them. But so that's usually a huge hurdle early on, especially for researchers too, because you're like trying to establish a baseline and how is this program going, and you start to see, maybe you start feeling like it's not going well, but it's because I think it's a natural inclination and a fear that they don't send folks. But eventually, like Candace said, after a couple of calls are handled, they start to say, these people are pretty great. Because the truth of the matter is, and I'm talking about officers like it's all one big, they're all the same. They're not the same. But I will say that I have gone through the training that officers go through, ICAT, to try and de-escalate with your voice. It's hard, right? And so you have people who have gone to school, who have, done clinical stuff. So, you want those people to start showing up because officers are trained to do it, but they're not professionals in it, right? And so then they start calling more and more, and they go and do the work that nobody else can do when somebody else has a gun or, something that's dangerous. And so they're able to go and do that. And in a city like Minneapolis, where you still have short shifts. When I came and visited 4 years ago, I think it's a little bit better now, but there were shifts where in the roll call room there were 2 officers. And what that feels like to an officer when you walk into a room and you only see one other person is, if I get in trouble, who's going to come help me? Right? And so also you just have all these calls. And so when folks become another resource, and then there are officers who feel bad, right, that I'm trying to help this person and I have a gun and a badge. Like, I'm not doing anything to help, right? So like, if I can actually get somebody who can get the person to help, then officers feel good about that. So that's kind of the life cycle I've seen happen over in different places, and it sounds like same thing that's happened here.
So Katie, I want to turn to you and ask, what were some of the kind of big results from the evaluation? What were some of the surprising findings to you, and where do you see the work in the research space going next?
Excellent question, because it sort of builds with some of the data off what you were hearing. So I think for me, perhaps maybe the most surprising finding was this broad acceptance from law enforcement in particular, and not just acceptance, but actually like deep gratitude for the BCR. And what we heard, again, like really across precincts, across sort of like levels, both in law enforcement, but also in dispatch, EMS, fire, was folks being like, I was skeptical at first, and then when I watched it unfold, or when I experienced it, or when I called for for BCR to come, I was like, this is incredible. We need more of this. In fact, every person that we interviewed in the broader safety ecosystem that had had at least one interaction in some way with BCR said, it's not a question of whether or not I'm supporting this or I think it's a good idea. Like, for me, my question back for you is like, how do we get more of it? We need more of it. How do we have more resource, more access, more spread geographically? This is working. This is supporting me in my work, and that's really what we saw in the data. So it was really exciting. I think this is why like local research can be really powerful, is because the assumption we might make is that law enforcement doesn't actually like this, and what we find here in Minneapolis in particular is it's quite the opposite. So that was surprising to me, because I was sort of, making assumptions about what I was hearing across the country. But I think a couple of other like top line findings for us, things that I think are really powerful, was that beyond sort of deep gratitude and excitement about this program in the safety ecosystem, we saw that reflected in community as well. So we were able to survey about 500 community members. We went to those places on the map that Michelle pointed out that had the most calls. So we really wanted to actually sort of oversample in the research world, but we really wanted to talk to people who are more likely to have a BCR van show up to their neighborhood. And we surveyed and were able to also interview residents of Minneapolis to ask for their perspectives and experiences with BCR. And across the board, I mean, this is one of those like findings as researchers, like when you're in the 91%, it's like everybody wants this, values it, appreciates it, is excited about it. And that was great, right? Super confirming for Candace and her team. But here was what we also found. Less than half of the people we surveyed, and again, we went to the places where BCR was more likely to respond, had ever heard of it. Right? So there's a huge knowledge gap about this approach, about this program. People don't know about it. And that was also a little bit surprising to me. I mean, I had not heard about it until we partnered with Canopy, and I thought maybe I was just behind, I sort of hadn't caught up. But the reality is what we found in community was that many people haven't heard about it. And so that was a big gap, and that was surprising and an important part of our finding to sort of say, the work is happening, people need to know about it, right? So that was sort of another thing. The last thing I'll just say to point out, to sort of put some data perhaps behind what Candace was talking about, is the calls that responders are attending to are really complex. And despite the fact that they are working on scope, we know that humans with, mental health crises are not just having sort of a singular mental health crisis in the moment. They might need social services, they might need housing support, they might need water and food. And what we found was that about 65% of the calls, so we analyzed about a year of data, about 10,000 calls, responders were doing very specific de-escalation, specific mental health and emotional support, and psychoeducation, both for individuals in crisis and their community members, which is really important. I can come back to that. So that's, 65% of calls, but overlapping, about a quarter of calls had direct transportation or warm handoffs to services, right? So in about a quarter of calls, in addition, they were supporting people, taking them where they needed to go, and also handing them off to services, shelters, mental health supports, hospitals sometimes. About a quarter of the calls, they connected them to supplies, right? So again, a big proportion of the calls, folks needed resource in the moment. They needed food, water, they needed a warm bed, a place to be, and so Canopy was able to do that. And then about a quarter of the calls, 26% had safety-related assessments. So that just shows like a full quarter of the calls, responders were doing suicide risk assessments, making safety plans, right? So serious mental health crises are unfolding, and Canopy responders are able to be there. And that's a pretty big percentage of these calls, right? So those are a lot of people in crisis that were being met with compassionate care, and I can't emphasize that enough. We talk about this a lot in our evaluation, but we did ride-alongs, we saw it unfold, we read through lots and lots of call narratives, but the approach that Canopy takes is really fully about meeting the person where they are with deep compassion. It's professional, it's patient. One of my favorite findings is a lot of people sort of, focus on like response time. How quickly are they able to be there? Well, we heard a lot from community members, and what we even saw in the call narratives was beyond how quickly were they able to get there, how long did they stay? And they stayed for a long time in some instances. They stayed and they sat with folks. They stayed and they sat with family members and neighbors and people who were in the greater area. And that doesn't happen all the time. So that was pretty remarkable too. So I think we could have this. Lots more to come, but those are top level.
Well, audience, we're going to turn to your questions in about another 10 minutes or so. There should still be cards on your seat. If you need cards or you have a card to hand in, just go ahead and raise your hands and folks will come and grab those. Okay, so Candace, let's come back to this idea. So as we've talked about, the BCR is both a mental health intervention and positioned in this public safety and emergency response ecosystem, which is not always a natural fit, right? Clinicians tend to operate in offices from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, right? Not driving around in a van around the city responding to 911 calls. And so I wanted to hear from you and then Ganesha about how both of your organizations think about your work together in this space. What are some of the tension points of having mental health professionals in this public safety ecosystem? What's going well, and where are there places where we might improve those points of connection?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say there's an incredible amount of things going well. And like I mentioned before, as it relates to being in this ecosystem with other first responders, it's gone way better than probably anyone expected it to. And so a lot of good going on. So I say that up front because I want to say that I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that when I name things that maybe aren't going so well, that does not mean that the whole thing is going great. So that being said, I would say that kind of the main things are kind of these bureaucratic things, right? Like the bureaucracy of a city, of a government. It has so many things in place that have been around for like forever, right? And then you have a new service or a company that's not even, the city coming in and trying to do something very different, something that's like not in line with the status quo. And then, that group of folks, that organization, and even that type of professional, mental health professional, has a very different orientation or approach to just being in the workplace and in the world. Has a very different orientation than the rest of this bureaucracy, and I think that makes it challenging, right? Our setup is not hierarchical, and then we're working with these highly hierarchical systems, right? If you're providing services to the community, you can't be hierarchical, right? And so we meet that need of the community, but it doesn't gel always very well with the bureaucratic, hierarchical system of a city, of an old public safety system anywhere. So I think that the bureaucratic systems have to make more adjustments, right, in order to say this is a service that is equal to the other types of, equal in importance to the other types of first responses. And it should be supported and protected in that same way. By the way, part of that support and protect is by creating laws that carve out this work as a legitimate profession, a defined profession, even aside from being a clinician. This is something different, just like you said. Mental health professionals don't typically go out and respond to calls, and so this really is like a defined, specific profession in and of itself, and having legislation and support in that way. There's also a lot of laws that protect first responders in certain ways. There's debates about how ethical some of those are, but those types of laws where they are protecting these type of first responders, those are the types of things that I mean. What I mean when I say elevating this as a defined, important, specific profession. That's one of the things that would help. I think some of the other things that kind of could change a little bit would be things that would be, I would say, like, there's outward investment, and then there's like internal investment, right? Minneapolis has been amazing. Like, they've truly put their money where their mouth is when it comes to this program. It was one of the funding that they've allocated to it is, especially at the time when they first started, it was historic. Most of the programs in the country were not this well funded, and most of them now for this size of city are not this well funded. And so Minneapolis has done an amazing job with like saying this is a priority and putting money behind it. But, I think, a way that Minneapolis can grow in supporting this kind of work and making this kind of service serve people the best is making some of those internal investments in change, and the change that needs to happen within their system to support this type of work, not just on the outside, but on the inside.
I'll be very quick because you have like 5,000 questions over there. I'll just add what Candace is saying is true from across the country that happened in Oklahoma City too, because we think about public safety with the police department, but fire is the same. And so I think you're starting to work with the fire department right now. The one other thing I would add to that is that 911 has become such a American tradition, if you will, right? That no joke, like people do call the cat in the tree kind of myth thing. one of my favorite but not funnies is a woman who caught her husband texting somebody and she wanted the police to come do something about it. Somebody did need to do something, but I don't know if it was the police. And so, you know, that reliance on 911, there are people who get mad when you try to send their issue to somebody other than a person in a uniform, versus you have some people who do not want a uniform anywhere near their home. So I think, to your point, the investments internal, the investments in the ecosystem, because the other thing that happens way too often is you don't have a bed or a resource to turn to. After you've stabilized there in the community, which is what you want to do, if you need other resources, they are lacking. And then the last piece I would just say is the education of the community about the resources and how they're actually helping public safety by asking folks to come that are not always in uniform.
Okay, so I was just trying to make sure we didn't get to the end with no questions, and you guys really over-delivered here in the audience today. But on the theme of things going right, I want to say one of these cards says, I recently had the opportunity to refer someone in the throes of a mental health crisis to BCR. Canopy Roots did an outstanding job. Thank you.
I'll pass that on to my staff. I tell them they make me look good. They make it easy to go out here and talk because they do all the work. So I'll pass it on to them. Thank you.
So a lot of these questions are about this question of scope and other responders. And so I'll turn this first to you, Canopy, but other folks can chime in. Some of the questions were things like, can you give us an example of scope creep? What kind of calls did you respond to that could be taken by you or another group but aren't your forte? Another question said, what is the difference between BCR and community responders? Another card said, what about domestic violence cases and when might those be in the scope? Another card said, what about overdoses? And when could those be? No, I'm not done. And another card, another card says, what are call types that are the most important for us to find non-police responders, even if it's Canopy or folks with a different skill set? So that's too much for you to answer in one answer, but just quickly, how do you think about sort of what other kinds of programs might look like?
Yeah, so for those of you who are not super familiar with this type of work, alternative response around the country looks very different. I would say, you know, one of the things as we've rolled out this program and really focused on improving the quality over the years is we've had to keep a really close kind of relationships with the other cities, so we learn from them about what they're doing and they learn from us as well. So those have been really enriching relationships, and you know, we pull a lot from that. But the programs that seem to be going well are the best, are the ones that really kind of have the most things wrapped into one. And this gels with, if you're a clinician, you know that clients tend to do better when their providers are under the same roof, because providers typically don't talk to each other unless they're in the same system or even hopefully in the same building. But that's is very similar here, right? Like if the same person who does follow-up responded to the call, is the person who responded to the call, that's best case scenario, right? That saves money because the people who already developed the rapport come back and do the follow-up, right? So since the beginning of the program, I've been like nudging the city, like, hey guys, can we, like, my staff can do this in their free time. And so those are the examples of things like you have a team who's already familiar with the community and what's happening, and they can do some things like follow-up. So like Canopy Roots runs another program in Los Angeles, and our program in Los Angeles is focused on specifically 911 calls for the unhoused population. And in that team, we have a response team, and then we also have a follow-up team. And so the follow-up team goes out and follows up and can continues with that short-term stabilization and housing stabilization that the responders started, right? And so it makes it really seamless when we kind of have both those teams. So that's a scenario that some cities have and that Minneapolis probably could benefit from. And then also community responders, we think of more so community responders as folks who are, sometimes community responder is used as a whole term for all of us. That's people who respond to calls that are not needed for police, or where police are not needed for. Sometimes it includes mental health professionals and practitioners, but also it can include people who do not have that education necessarily, but have a lot of intensive training on how to deal with people and how to de-escalate, but also how to mediate even. There's a great program, gosh, somewhere in the southern part of this country that has mediators that go out, which, my goodness, I was like, oh, I wish we had the funding for that. That's amazing. And so there's different types of professionals on community responder teams, but the main theme is that they all respond to calls that are not police aren't necessarily needed for, and it could be mental health professionals, but it also includes people with lived experience and connection to the community. So like someone maybe who is formerly incarcerated. Our team in Los Angeles, we have a lot of formerly incarcerated folks who work on that team, and they take those calls. They don't necessarily need a mental health professional for that call. It might be a dispute, or it might be, for instance, a neighbor dispute, or it might be a code violation. It might be a variety of things where maybe they're mental health adjacent, and maybe you need to have those mental health professionals ready to come out there if needed. However, it could just be someone who is like, hey, let's figure this out together, and they don't have to have a degree or a license, right? And so a team like Minneapolis, where we just deal with, where we just have mental health professionals, we could, and I have proposed to the city a while back that we can add professionals to cover some of those calls that are not necessarily in our scope, but to get some of those calls that they want to send to us, but that is not currently within our scope and doesn't require a mental health practitioner or professional. Did I?
Can I just add what we saw? So I think, and sometimes it's helpful to have some concretes, right? So it's like, what are those calls that are outside of scope? What we saw, and we were able to really dig into just a subsection of about 1,000 calls, like reading the narratives, was that mental health crises, in terms of the primary driver, if you will, like for the call, for sure was the number one. But the other things that we saw concretely were things like welfare checks. I need you to check on my elderly neighbor. I haven't seen them come out of the house. I need you to check on a loved one who I know may be in crisis right now, but I don't know if they are, but I think I'm concerned for their welfare. The other thing that we saw was evidence, the primary drivers of the call being substance use disorder. So to just sort of put a finer point on what Candace is saying, there are lots of other community responders and professionals that can show up and say, if this is really the primary driver, how do we address this substance use challenge right now in the moment, knowing that mental health support may be needed. A third one we saw were housing and basic needs. So in some ways, again, unsurprisingly, looking at some of Canopy's data, that I like to say the sort of silver lining sometimes of scope creep is that it can be like a needs assessment. Like, where are they actually responding, and where are our needs, therefore, if we have to really scope what our mental health professionals can do. And we saw a lot of responses where the primary driver was about housing and basic needs. The last two were family and relationship conflicts. So the mediator piece is really critical here, right? So in these calls that were not, there was no weapon, or they were not like highly violent at the moment, but it was a crisis. It felt like a crisis to these individuals who were having a conflict that needed to be mediated. It wasn't necessarily mental health related. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But that is a real reason why, to Ganesha's point, people call 911, right? And so dispatch is trying to figure out who do we send and how do we send them? And compassionate care feels like a good choice, even if it's not like perfect and within scope, to send to those conflicts. And then finally, the last one were really these safety and violence risks. So Canopy does an incredible job, and some of the stories, the video that Michelle mentioned, really highlight when folks really truly lives are being saved, when people are, you know, at risk to their own safety, that Canopy is able to respond in really powerful ways to de-escalate those spaces and save people's lives. So those are some examples of the other things in addition to behavioral or mental health crises that we saw.
Great. So Ganesha, let's turn to you for a moment and just think about we've really been focused on the calls that Canopy is responding to. And I'd love to think about more broadly how you think that programs like this might change how law enforcement responds on the calls they're going to, right? So how does knowing, for instance, that you can call in the BCR for backup potentially change how law enforcement responds to calls? How does perhaps that collaboration on that small subset of calls, right, help to provide on-the-job training and socialization for officers around mental health awareness? Are there ways that mental health can be better integrated into the law enforcement curriculum now that we've got this team of experts who is responding to crises in the community? But how do we think broadly about how these kinds of programs might impact law enforcement more directly?
Yeah, something you just said made me think about, so I also do work in increasing women in policing. There is a grassroots program called 30 by 30 that has the goal of increasing women in policing by 30% by 2030. And the research behind that really is a couple of things. Women use force less, women get sued less, actually, when you have a woman that is paired often with a male counterpart, it shows that her effect affects him. So that there's less use of force, less, all those different things. And so I don't have any empirical data on this, but I do believe when people can see things being modeled and can be seen, things being done a different way. One of the big conversations in the past 15 years in policing has been this guardian versus warrior kind of mentality. And a part of the messy middle is when you're at the police academy, and the police catch a lot of flack for this us versus them, right? But there are people in police academies that feel a obligation that person doesn't go out there and die. So they do kind of pump them with, you got to be careful. I mean, they show videos of like just this nice person, you walk up on them, and then, we know Officer Jamal Mitchell lost his life trying to go and help a shooting victim. And so there's this right in your head. And I think that if you're around that culture all the time, it's just inculcated, right? And this is legitimate. You don't want to die as a police officer, but there's other ways to handle things, right? And so I think to actually see that modeled by folks and actually see, oh, wow, that worked. I think that's helpful. The other thing I'll say, I spent 8 hours yesterday in an all-day training, all of the executive command did in wellness. In our early intervention system. So how do you get to officers before issues become a problem? And we talked about divorce, financial issues, all sorts of things that happen at home that then you have to come and help people in crisis all day. And so we talked about coping mechanisms. We talked about the different things that you can do. I will say if there's any silver lining to COVID, silver lining is probably the wrong thing to say. There's nothing good about COVID, except for the fact as a society, we got more comfortable talking about mental health and what isolation does and just how things happen to us as people. The same thing is happening in policing much more slowly because there is this kind of categorization to try to deal with. I always say this, like I guess it's the truth for you all too, but like if you come to work every day and your whole day is going to other people's issues, it can be very difficult. And I can tell you, policing has not done a good job of actually trying to restore people after seeing horrible things that have happened to kids and older people and stuff like that. So I do think the modeling, one, is helpful. I think the other thing, too, is just feeling the pressure taken off of you. I am sitting here in a situation. I don't know what to do. I am scared and worried for this person's welfare. I don't have the skills to help. I can call somebody, right, to help me. And there are studies that show that not having those highly traumatic, stressful calls every day, all day, that can come off the CAD just for a second is better for officer wellness. So I think for all of those reasons, these programs are super helpful.
Can I add something to that?
I was just going to say one thing on one of the questions, and I'm happy to turn the mic to you. I was just going to say, I love that last piece, because I think one of the concerns about programs like BCR, and it shows up in one of these cards, is that if we divert a substantial number of calls away from the police and focus law enforcement on calls that involve violence, calls where there's a heavy risk, does that actually, in a roundabout, complicated way, potentially worsen police-community relationships and police well-being and their ability to show up and not have that kind of safety-first mindset? Yeah. And I think actually what you just shared there, I mean, I think first of all, like, the scale of these programs is still small enough that, like, we do not need to be worrying that we are, right, like, displacing police entirely next month. But second of all, I do think this idea that it's not as though the calls that they're getting a better responder for are calls where the police are making good connections with the communities or sort of having positive interactions, but they're the calls where officers themselves are feeling a lot of stress about their inability to respond well to the person's need in that moment, and perhaps frees officers up to do more of that community policing and engagement beyond those coffee with cops, to bring it back to the morning panel. But yeah, Candace, you wanted the next word?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Ganesha was saying about how the presence of some of these alternative responders tend to change the system. One of the things that we noticed is the responders over the years, as I talked to them, they would tell me about how their relationship with the officers was changing. And one of the things that they found is they would say, they're learning from us. And I was like, you know, I anticipated that, because people are people no matter what. They learn from each other. No matter who you introduce something new into a system, it changes it. And one thing that I would love to see for the future of this work is for cities, Minneapolis, whoever's doing this work, to invest in measuring that impact. How has this system changed with the introduction? How's the culture changed? How has the outcome and the impact changed when we introduce responders?
Yeah. Well, that was a beautiful note to end, and I'm getting alarm bells here, but I do want to say one more comment from the card, and I feel like the JRC staff, you guys want me to say this card, so I'm going to go over time, because this card says, what are your thoughts about how to make this effort more widely known and support programs like the BCR? And then it says, how can philanthropy support this? And I really hope the person who wrote this was a philanthropist, because you all are in the room. So I just wanted to give everybody a last chance to say, how can people in community, how can people with money, how can system leaders, how can we support this work and grow awareness of it? Where do we go next?
Part.
Give us all the money.
Yeah, the resource. I'll just say really, really briefly, because now it's counting in a negative. It's really angry at us, the timer. We do have some, empirical evidence, right? Like, we have some data from the research that we did to say, one of my favorite interviews is with an officer who said after responding with BCR, they wrote down a sentence that the responder said, something like, I see this is hard for you, and they bring it to their to the call. It was just amazing, right? Like, again, small anecdote, but like that evidence, like we saw that in the conversations. We have that evidence. And so I think more of that to Candace, like, obviously, what am I going to say? Fund the research, but like, seriously, fund the research, I think, is really important because we're able to say, like, we're experiencing that. How can we turn to data to really highlight what y'all know, right? How can we then share this out? And then the last piece I'll say is, what can community members do? Like, you've got it. Everybody needs to leave here today and tell somebody they know about this program. I mean, that's not going to be enough. There has to be large education campaigns, but we have to also do the work. We do have power as community members to be able to share what's happening with your small communities, with your larger communities. And so the more people know and understand, the more people can show up, can advocate for better resource, for legislation, to professionalize this. Like, all that happens when communities are shouting for it to happen. That's why this started in Minneapolis. You set us up at the beginning to say we were loud enough on the streets, and this happened. The efforts were underway, but it really pushed it, and now we're here today. So that is what we need from community members here and not here, I think, moving forward.
All right, I'm going to say that's a place to close it. So thank you, everyone.